This happened to me just over a year ago. I'm 25 years old and own a small townhouse in a quiet neighborhood. I live by myself, which can get pretty dull, so I often invite friends over whenever I can. My closest friends visit a couple of times a week and sometimes even spend the night to get away from their own homes. I didn't have any plans for this night, but I had made plans for the following day with my friend, Lisa, who was supposed to come over for a movie night. I was really just trying to get through this night. Looking forward to the next day, I went to bed early, around 9:15 p.m. In the middle of the night, I suddenly woke up. I glanced at my bedside clock. It was 2 a.m. The way I woke up was strange. My heart was racing, and my mind was unusually sharp, as if something was wrong. I thought maybe I just had a bad dream or something, but then I heard a click coming from downstairs. I sat up in bed as a door slowly creaked open, and I heard footsteps entering my home. Despite being scared, I thought it might be Lisa or another friend since they all had keys to my place in case they needed somewhere to crash. I got out of bed, opened my bedroom door, and stepped into the hallway. "Lisa," I called out. No one answered. I stood in the hallway for what felt like forever. But then, suddenly, a bright light flickered on, lighting up the hallway downstairs. A second later, I heard a faint murmur of voices coming from the living room. Whoever it was had turned on the TV. For a moment, I felt relieved, thinking it had to be one of my friends who had maybe had too much to drink. I walked down the stairs and into the living room, but as soon as I did, I felt my entire body go cold. A random man was sitting on my couch, staring at the TV. He looked about 50 years old, with long, scraggly black hair and dirty clothes. As I stood there, frozen in fear, he turned his head, glanced at me, and gave me a crooked smile. He even waved his hand, as if inviting me to sit down next to him on the couch. I didn't hesitate. I spun around and ran out the front door as fast as I could. I pounded on my neighbor's door until they let me in and called the police. By the time they arrived, though, the man was gone. No sign of him at all. What made it worse was that the police didn't take it seriously, suggesting it was probably just a harmless homeless man looking for a place to stay. But I see it differently. The man picked the lock on my door, sat on my couch, turned on the TV, and then smiled at me like that, as if he knew me. I think he might have been stalking me or something, and now, every time I'm alone at night, I can't help but wonder if I'm really alone. I've lived in this house for almost a decade now. It's a standard, medium-sized home, which made sense when I shared it with others. But after they left and I was the only one living here, the extra space felt unnecessary. Technically, it's a 3-bedroom house, but I only use 2 rooms, one as my bedroom and the other as my game room. The third room is at the far end of the upstairs hallway. One has a few storage boxes, and the other is completely empty. One night, after finishing work at around 9 p.m., I grabbed some fast food on the way home and went straight to the game room. I was off the next day, so I planned to play video games all night. I put on my headphones and started a game, but just before I got into a match, I thought I heard something like a knock at the front door. I took off my headphones and listened, but when I didn't hear anything else, I figured if someone was really there, they would knock again. So I went back to my game. About an hour or 2 later, I heard it again. It sounded like a faint knock or maybe a door closing, but with my headphones on and the door to my room shut, it was hard to tell. I got up and opened my door, peering into the hallway, waiting to hear the sound again. When nothing happened, I went downstairs to check the front door. No one was there and everything seemed normal. Feeling uneasy, I made sure the door was locked before heading back upstairs. This time, I left my room door open, hoping I might hear the sound more clearly if it happened again. I put my headphones back on and resumed gaming. I played through an entire round, which took about 20 minutes. As the game ended, I leaned back in my chair, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure dart past the open doorway. I ripped off my headphones and jumped out of my chair, frozen in fear, unsure of what to do next. I stood there for several minutes before finally gathering the courage to check the hallway and then the rest of the house. No one was there, but the front door was unlocked again. When the police came to investigate, they discovered that someone had been hiding, likely living, in the empty room at the end of the hallway. I hadn't been in that room for weeks, maybe even months, so all this time, someone could have been just on the other side of the wall without me knowing. It's terrifying to think about, especially considering what could have happened if I had confronted them. My buddy Mark and I share a house together. Mark is quite the party animal and often stays out late or crashes at other people's places. So many nights I end up having the house to myself. One of those nights, Mark was out at a bar or something, so I decided to enjoy the evening alone. I grabbed a couple of beers and sat on the swinging bench we had on the front porch. The weather was pleasant, and since it was close to midnight, most of the neighborhood was asleep, making it quiet. After sitting out for about an hour, I noticed a person walking down the street in front of the houses. He was a large man, wearing a hoodie with the hood pulled over his head. However, something seemed off about the way he moved. His steps were stiff, as if only his legs were functioning while his upper body remained oddly still. When he reached the part of the road in front of my house, he stopped and stared directly at me. I waited a few moments for him to say something, but he just stood there, silently watching me from the middle of the street. "Hey man, do you need something?" I called out. He stayed silent for a moment before he started walking up my driveway. I got up from the bench and shouted at him to leave, but as he got closer, I quickly went inside and locked the door behind me. I peeked through the peephole and saw him approach the door. He paused for a moment, then pulled something from under his sweatshirt. It was hard to make out through the small view I had, but it looked like a hammer or a crowbar. Realizing what might happen next, I ran upstairs and locked myself in the bedroom, dialing 911 while trying to stay quiet. I could hear the wood splintering off the door downstairs as I urgently asked the operator for help. Then, there was a loud crash followed by silence, the only sound being the broken door swaying on its hinges. I waited anxiously, expecting to hear his footsteps coming up to the bedroom door at any moment, but the seconds turned into minutes until I finally heard a police car pull into the driveway. I considered running downstairs to meet the officers, but the operator suddenly advised me to stay where I was and wait for the police to come to me. So I sat back down. About 30 seconds later, I heard one of the officers coming up the stairs, followed by shouting and the sound of a taser being fired. The guy had been standing right outside the bedroom door as if he was waiting for me to open it. He was arrested, and as it turns out, he was very drunk. I have no idea who he was or why he did what he did. According to the officers, he wouldn't explain why he was walking down the street or what his intentions were. All I know is if I had opened that door, it could have been the last thing I ever did. This happened in Montana in the late 80s when I was a young teenager during the middle of winter. My family and I lived in a small house deep in the forest. When I say deep in the forest, I mean the closest store and neighbor were at least a 30-minute drive from where we lived. It was probably around 11 p.m., and my dad worked night shifts, so it was just my mom and me at home. It was a typical night until things took a terrifying turn. We had just finished dinner, and my mom was clearing the table. She asked me to wash the dishes, so I started on them. As I was waiting for the cold water to heat up, I noticed the outside lights suddenly went out. My reflection in the window, combined with the light being off, made it very difficult to see, but I could just make out what seemed like a face. Whoever or whatever it was staring directly at me. I was completely shocked but wiped the fog from the window with a cloth to get a clearer view. As soon as I moved the cloth away, a blinding light shone directly at me. I squinted and looked away because it hurt my eyes, but then the light abruptly turned off. I could still see the figure standing at a distance, watching me. My mom then put the remaining dishes in the sink, snapping me out of my daze. I backed away from the window, and when my mom asked what was wrong, I told her someone was out there watching me and that they had shined a flashlight into our window. She didn't believe me at first, but I insisted, confused about how she hadn't noticed the light when it flashed on me. She must have had her back turned or something. Why Mom thought I was joking, so she didn't even bother to check. Once I felt a bit safer, I walked back to the window to look outside, but there was no one there. The figure had vanished, which gave me a small sense of relief. But suddenly, the doorknob started rattling as if someone was trying to open the door. My mom screamed, and we both grabbed small kitchen knives. Whoever was outside started pulling on the door even harder and began kicking it, clearly trying to break in. We were incredibly fortunate because my dad arrived just in time. His boss had let him leave work early that night, and if not for that, I believe my mom and I wouldn't have survived. As soon as my dad pulled into the driveway, the intruder ran off. But my dad didn't hesitate. He shot at the man with his Glock 5 times, hitting him with every shot. The man died within minutes. After confirming that the intruder was dead, my dad took us to the police station to report what happened. My dad didn't face any charges. It was clearly self-defense. When the police arrived at our home, they found that the man was indeed trying to break in. He had a handgun hidden in his pants, along with a sharp 6-inch knife. He also had mace and handcuffs. I don't like to imagine what his intentions were because it still haunts me to this day. I'm just thankful that my dad showed up when he did, and that he took action before anything worse could happen. A few months later, we moved out of that house to a new one that my dad and a few of his friends helped build for us. I lived there for about 5 years until I moved in with my girlfriend in a nearby town. We now have our own apartment, and life has been going well since then. However, this is a story I often find myself telling every now and then. In the summer of 2011, a group of friends and I decided to plan a small camping trip to a forest just a few miles outside her hometown. Although Delamere Forest was relatively small, it offered a much-needed escape to nature. City life has its perks, but it can feel suffocating, so any chance to retreat to the countryside was always welcome. But as the camping trip neared, things started to go wrong. One by one, friends began canceling, citing reasons like family illness, lack of funds, or just plain laziness. Eventually, only 2 of us decided to go. Early on a sunny summer morning, we boarded a train for the forest. The weather was perfect, a clear sky with a gentle breeze that made our hike through the woods more bearable than expected. We soon found a good spot in the shade, right by a stream we could use for drinking and washing. The only problem was that the area was very open and visible from the nearby trails, making it far from discreet. By late afternoon, tired from our hike, we decided to build a fire to cook dinner. Building a fire is a key part of camping. Sure, but it also draws attention. The smell of burning wood and cooking food, along with the smoke, can practically announce your presence to the entire forest. We weren't surprised when a group of locals came across our camp and stopped to say hello. At first, they seemed friendly enough, but I couldn't shake a bad feeling about them. It's interesting how human instincts can pick up on subtle clues, like body language or the way someone talks, that tell us something isn't right. Whether it was the way the locals glanced at each other or the strange questions they asked, I sensed their intentions weren't good. After they left and were out of earshot, my friend suggested we move the camp. Normally, he's the jumpy one who I'm always telling to calm down, but this time I knew he was right. Maybe we were being paranoid, but in situations like this, it's better to be cautious. Even though we were tired and slightly drunk, we packed up, put out the fire, and started searching for another spot. Luckily, we found one quickly, on a wooded hill that overlooked our old campsite. Though we couldn't see it directly, a short walk away gave us a decent view of the area, at least during the day. As the sun set, we lit another fire, cooked some ramen in our mess tins, and then proceeded to drink and smoke until we were too exhausted to continue. We talked nonsense around the fire until we were too tired to stay up, then retreated to our shelters for the night. I must have passed out as soon as I got into my sleeping bag because I don't remember drifting off. The next thing I knew, I woke up in pitch darkness to the sound of a distant car revving its engine. At first, I was just irritated to be woken up. The hangover was hitting hard, and I felt awful as I tried to go back to sleep. But the sound of the car kept getting louder, and I realized it was coming closer. Something urged me to check it out. By the time I heard voices, I thought it might just be some kids joyriding in a stolen car. But, as I mentioned, sometimes it's better to be safe than sorry. When I reached the edge of the hill, I could see flashlights all around our old campsite. The revving engine was from a vehicle that had driven all the way down the forest path to where we had camped earlier. Someone was down there looking for us. I think I acted more on instinct than anything else, quickly and quietly waking my friend. I must have explained what I saw 2 or 3 times before he fully understood. He was just as tired and slightly drunk as I was. But when it finally sank in, he got up and helped me put out our dying fire. We grabbed the binoculars we had with us and ran back to the hill's edge to watch in horror. We could see what the men were holding in their hands, thanks to the flashlights they were shining on each other. Baseball bats, hammers, and a length of rope were just a few of the things they carried. They spat and cursed, angry that they had arrived too late to catch us and do who knows what. All we had to defend ourselves were our Swiss Army knives. If those guys had decided to search the area, they would have found us easily, and I'm not sure I'd be here telling this story today. But fortunately, they didn't. Maybe they were drunk themselves or just too lazy to look for us. But thank God they didn't. With one of us keeping watch, the other packed our gear as quickly as possible. The men down below stayed around our old camp, kicking at the fire we had so carefully built, taking out their frustration on the things we had left behind. As I mentioned before, they didn't seem eager to search for us, but they also didn't seem in a hurry to leave. This meant we were stuck on that wooded hill, as trying to escape with our heavy packs would have been risky. If they saw us, there was no way we could outrun them, especially since they had a vehicle. We ended up staying there until morning. Neither of us could sleep, despite the gang leaving with their car. I remember being terrified that they would return, maybe with more people or more determination to find us, but they didn't. They were probably sleeping off their own hangovers by the time we were on the train home. We had planned to stay for another 2 nights, and I was still annoyed that we had to cut the trip short. But with those local thugs around, we didn't want to take any chances. Be careful when you're traveling, whether it's abroad or close to home, because while the kindness of strangers can be heartwarming, some people aren't so friendly. In Scotland a few years back, 2 friends and I took an overnight bus from Liverpool to Dumfries for a week of wild camping. The main difference between wild camping and regular camping is the absence of tents. Wild campers don't use them. Instead, they make basic shelters using ponchos or tarps and sleep on the bare ground. It's not always comfortable, but it's a challenge that toughens you up. Around 5 o'clock in the morning, with hardly any sleep, we tried to navigate the Scottish countryside. Of course, we took a wrong turn. We had about 6.5 miles ahead of us, roughly 9 hours of walking, and we managed to get lost 2 minutes in. I couldn't believe we were that clueless, even at such an early hour. We must have looked like an odd trio as we stopped a passing cyclist to ask for directions. He was typically friendly and helpful, pointing us the right way. We turned a corner and caught sight of a war memorial that served as a navigational checkpoint. We couldn't help but stop, laying our packs on the benches near the memorial to take a breather. The memorial was at a crossroads, reminding me of stories where people would take their own lives and be buried at such places, which made me uneasy. Bathed in warm golden sunlight, we headed southwest towards Gargan Bridge. The pavement was narrow, and we often had to step onto the road to stay level. To our left, a rise revealed our first rabbit, which seemed like a good omen. We pretended to aim at it with imaginary scopes, making popping sounds and rubbing our bellies. The rabbit noticed us and quickly scampered into a hedgerow. We continued walking with our heavy packs, passing a tacky sign of a faux stone house with two plastic-looking swords sticking out of it, bearing something in Gaelic. "Only in Scotland," one of us panted. We reached Gargan Bridge, crossing the river with an old blacksmith's dwelling at its base. We worked our way up a gentle slope past a local secondary school and reached a farm track. We were making good time, and there were no farmhands in the fields, just grazing livestock. The farmer's house was well kept, but the cattle shed and nearby buildings looked run down, possibly home to bats. Sheep and lambs noticed us and skittered away. We navigated past the cattle shed and clambered over two fences to avoid a large waste tank. This maneuver inadvertently put us right in front of another fence, the electrified kind. "Is that electric?" someone asked. I followed the wire with my gaze and saw it connect sharply with a battery unit. I grimaced. It was too high to jump over, and our packs made it impossible to crawl under. I imagined what an electric shock to sensitive areas would feel like. I spotted a large piece of deadwood nearby, surrounded by fresh cow pats like landmines. Carefully avoiding them, I dragged the deadwood to the fence. It was heavy enough to pin it down, and as I stepped over, I heard it buzz faintly. We crossed two fields, climbing another fence between them, which was not easy with heavy packs. I took out my phone to film the ascent of the first of many hills. We started to breathe heavily as our packs suddenly felt twice as heavy. We leaned forward to maintain momentum, our steps becoming strained and small. I put the phone away as we reached the steepest point. The banter stopped, and we heaved ourselves up the grassy slope. I started to feel hungry as our first rest point came into view, a planned stop to orient ourselves. We laid down our packs just a few yards away from where we had camped on a previous trip and rested our aching legs. My friend Corky took off his shirt, which was soaked with sweat, and I noticed steam rising from his shoulders. "Jesus, Martin," the other guy exclaimed. "There's actual steam coming off you." We laughed as we took out tobacco and food. Martin and I had the same Scotch oatcakes, which we ate with cheese spread, sharing Martin's Jetboil coffee. The Jetboil was incredibly handy and would almost become the center of our lives for the next week. Corky changed into dry civilian clothes and eyed a tin of all-day breakfast, reading out some of the ingredients. It was much cooler in the shade, and we gazed out across the landscape, either picking bits of oatcake out of our teeth or smoking rolled cigarettes. It was already 7 o'clock in the morning, yet our sleep deprivation made it feel later in the day. This was mildly disorienting, but we estimated our arrival at Lahal Bar by around 10 o'clock. Corky was skeptical, still expecting another obstacle after the wrong turn. His feeling was justified when, after moving slowly but steadily along the ridge of the hill, we reached a small collection of houses that served as a landmark. After some deliberation, we decided to cross a field of cows that had the only fence we could easily cross. We were partly motivated by the idea that it seemed quick and easy, and partly to avoid another more threatening electric fence. About halfway across the field, I noticed the numerous cows beginning to stare at us. Usually, this wouldn't be particularly intimidating, but their numbers and hostile stares made me slow my step. "They're all looking at us," I said. "They're just curious," Martin replied. The cows began walking towards us, spreading out in a line. It reminded me of a battle formation. "They're walking towards us now," I said. "They just want to check us out," Martin reassured. The cows started to trot, then broke into a cumbersome gallop. Corky stopped and started walking backward. "They're running at us." I too stopped and began to turn. Over my shoulder, I saw a small enclosure with electrical conductors in it. "Run, dude, run!" Corky yelped, and we tried to sprint under our packs, which amounted to a hobble. I had already made up my mind. Death by electricity had to be quicker than being trampled. "Don't run!" Martin screamed, The command fired off in my brain instantly. I stopped, spun around, and threw my arms into the air, making myself appear large. Corky did the same, and without a moment's hesitation, the charging cows responded. They stopped, or at least slowed their pace. I heard indistinct shouting from the other side of the field. It was the farmer, bidding us to move along the fence to the gate. "See, we're good. Just keep moving," Martin said, reassured. We moved slowly and compactly, arms outstretched, as the cows surrounded us, jostling for a view. They were aggressive with each other. Some even mounted the cows in front of them to get a better look. "This is fine," I told myself. "This is all going to be okay. Nice cows. This is completely safe." Despite my attempts at reassurance, I was genuinely terrified, limbs shaking as I climbed over the wooden gate. The farmer addressed us. "Hey there, just curious. They just wanted to have a wee look. If you stick to the edge of the field, you'll do all right. If you had gone across, then, well, I don't know. Could you tell us a good route to maybe the house?" I asked. "Yeah, just follow this road here. It's usually quiet. Then turn right at the main road and follow it. Don't turn off into the farm. Just keep going, and you'll find the road to the house." "Okay. Cheers, mate." We were relieved for his help. He seemed mildly interested in us, but was clearly more annoyed by the commotion. Pretty much every time I've told this story since, people have laughed. I get it. A bunch of city kids getting scared by cows is definitely a bit funny. But at the time, it scared the life out of us. Especially when we got home and realized just how much danger we were in. You see, cows kill more people each year than sharks, often in the exact way I described. A hiker or walker cuts across a field instead of going around it, and they get trampled. In fact, the UK Health and Safety Executive has reissued advice to farmers not to put calves and their mothers in fields accessible to the public as a precaution. So, next time you consider taking a shortcut through a field, make sure it's not occupied. You might get an unexpected surprise. One of the oldest regions of its kind in the southern United States, covering almost 2 million acres of untouched wilderness, making it a prime spot for unforgettable hunting experiences. The name Ouachita is believed to come from the Choctaw words "oe," meaning hunt, and "shoto," meaning big, translating to big hunt far from home. So, during hunting season, the place is packed with hunters in bright orange caps and high-visibility jackets. My friends and I, being East Coasters through and through, never really got into hunting. Until we visited Arkansas, I hadn't even ventured much beyond Pennsylvania. Our idea of enjoying nature doesn't involve slaughtering a freshly hunted animal. So, when we learned that there was a period during the height of summer when hunting in the Ouachita was completely banned, we were thrilled. There would be whole parts of the forest virtually deserted, and we'd have the place all to ourselves, or so we thought. We drove 8 hours each day for 3 days to make it to Arkansas from our home in Haverhill, Massachusetts. The thought of driving 1,500 miles straight was unbearable, so we turned it into a road trip, stopping in Philly, D.C., and Nashville. Honestly, I could move to D.C. just for the mumbo sauce. I saw it on Anthony Bourdain and had to try it. Trust me, it does not disappoint. By the time we finally arrived at Ouachita National Forest, we were more than ready to leave the modern world behind and soak up the peace and beauty of nature. That's a fancy way of saying we were eager to get thoroughly drunk around a roaring fire while belting out Dropkick Murphys songs, which we did, maybe with a little too much enthusiasm. After just 2 of the 4 nights we planned to camp in Ouachita, we ran out of beer and tobacco. Not the best timing, either. Late in the afternoon, we opened our coolers to find only 3 beers left, barely enough to last us on what would surely be a long walk to the nearest liquor store. Outlaw Liquor was little more than a wooden shack on the edge of a small town called Crystal Springs. It took us about 3 hours of steady walking to get there, but I assure you, it was worth every step. At first, we couldn't tell if we were in a liquor store or a hunting lodge. Taxidermy black bears, Deer, turkeys, and foxes were scattered everywhere. Jeff, the owner, showed us the locally made wines and spirits and even offered us samples of some of the more unique brews. We went in planning to grab a six-pack or two and left with our backpacks stuffed full of beers, some of Jeff's homemade beef jerky, a few small bottles of homemade wine, and a bottle each of what Jeff called barrel-aged Abraxas, a locally brewed stout with an 11% alcohol content. Yes, you read that right, 11%. The sun was starting to sink below the horizon by the time we got anywhere close to our campsite. Our aching feet from hours of walking were numbed by the alcohol we sipped as we trudged along. I had already opened my pack of jerky, handing out strips to my friends in the hopes it might soak up some of the booze. We had reached that point in a drinking session when our bladders were getting uncomfortably full, so every now and then, one of us would have to step off the trail for a bathroom break. It was a beautiful evening. Crickets chirped, bats flitted around, chirping softly as they used sonar to catch bugs. When it was my turn to take a break, my friends sat down at the edge of the trail with their beers, while I wandered off into the woods to find a suitable spot. I found one, took care of business, and was about to head back when I heard something through the trees. It sounded like people, their voices low, and the crunch of leaves underfoot. In my half-drunken state, I thought it might be fun to introduce myself, maybe share a few drinks, tell some stories, make some new friends, but these people weren't interested in making friends. As I pushed through a thick patch of brush and into a small clearing, I realized just how bad of an idea that was. As soon as I emerged, 3 or 4 men in the clearing turned to look at me, their faces twisted in angry surprise. They were dressed in rough clothes, tattered leather boots, lots of denim, and each held a weapon. Machetes, Bowie knives, and one had a rusted spiked club that looked like it could have been centuries old. Lying hogtied on the ground between them was a young woman, her body covered in bruises and cuts. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Never in my life had I heard anything as disturbing as the sounds she made through her gag. When I finally managed to tear my eyes away from the horrifying scene, I looked up at one of the men standing over her. He was smiling and, with one smooth motion, raised a single finger to his lips, signaling me to stay quiet. I turned and started walking, slowly at first. I didn't want them to think I was going to panic or call the police or something. I tried to stay calm, but after a few seconds, I broke into a run, sprinting back towards the trail. I didn't need to say anything to my friends. They started running as soon as they saw my face. We ran and ran until one of my friends threw up beer and half-digested jerky all over himself. But by that point, we were safe. No one was following us. When I told them what I'd seen, a heated argument broke out. One friend wanted to call the police immediately, while the other insisted we get out of the woods as quickly as possible, which would mean driving drunk until we could find a motel. We couldn't risk calling the cops and getting a DUI, not in Missouri. We decided to call the police first, then get out of there and into a hotel before we got pulled over, breathalyzed, and arrested. We never heard back from the police. My friend gave them all the details over the phone, but I never got any closure about what I saw that night. I often wonder what happened to that girl, if she was rescued and is living a peaceful, happy life now. But sometimes, in the darkest moments, I know deep down that she didn't make it out of Ouachita. Even if she survived, a part of her would be forever lost in that clearing, taken by cruel, wild men. After heading out on a camping adventure in the Scottish Highlands, we faced some harsh conditions. The weather was relentless, and the rugged terrain didn't make it any easier. Despite these challenges, the trip was largely successful. No one got hurt, no one got lost, and nothing even remotely unsettling happened, at least until the last night. When we finally returned to the small Scottish village where we were supposed to catch our bus, we were both physically and emotionally drained. 5 days in the mountains will do that to you. We had barely slept or eaten, so the sight of a small greasy cafe almost brought tears to our eyes. The locals stared at us as we walked in, and honestly, I couldn't blame them. We were a sight, bloodshot eyes, greasy hair, and clothes reeking of smoke from huddling around fires. The villagers were curious but friendly. The cafe owner asked about our trip, taking great pleasure in our awe of the highlands. Complimenting the locals on their toughness for living in such a barren place always won you points. With full bellies, we headed to the only pub in the village. They welcomed us warmly and even stayed open an hour later than usual so we'd have a place to stay warm while waiting for our late-night bus. We left the pub about 20 minutes before the bus was due, thanking the staff for their hospitality, and made our way down the dimly lit streets towards the village's only bus stop. The bus stop was right next to a small bridge that crossed the river running through the village. With the dim, flickering streetlights, we could tell there was a bridge, but we couldn't see what was on it. As we anxiously watched the clock, counting down the minutes until we could go home to hot showers, warm beds, and proper food, we suddenly heard a sound from the other side of the river, a grunting noise. We were too tired and buzzed to think much of it at first, but the noise grew louder and more distinct until we realized there was someone on the other side of the bridge, sounding drunk and angry. I can't remember who, but someone among us was curious enough to muster the energy to check it out. I didn't watch them go, but I heard their heavy boots clanging against the metal bridge as they slowly climbed to the top. A few moments later, they hurried back down the bridge, their footsteps quicker than before. "Grab your bags now," they hissed, trying to stay quiet. We had no idea what was happening. I thought it might be some kind of prank, a last-minute attempt to add a bit of excitement to our trip. But one look at my friend's terrified eyes told me he was serious. I had never seen him so scared. As if to confirm the urgency, I began hearing the same kind of footsteps on the metal bridge. Someone was coming across the bridge quickly, making the same angry grunting noises. None of us wanted to take a risk, so we grabbed our heavy packs and hurried across the road into a small, dark street in the village. We hid in the shadows, trying to stay out of sight, but still keeping an eye on the bridge, all of us eager to see what had terrified our friend so much. Then we saw him, a man stumbling down the bridge's metal stairs, something shiny in his hand. "Is that a machete?" one of us gasped. As soon as those words were spoken, the man zeroed in on our voices. He raised the large blade, pointing it toward the alleyway where we thought we were hidden. "You!" he shouted in a thick Scottish accent, then began charging down the stairs, waving the machete as he ran. We bolted, sprinting down the dark street with no idea where we were going, just needing to get away from this crazed, blade-wielding man. Whoever was in the lead had the sense to loop around the block. If we got too far from the bus stop, we'd miss our ride, and the next bus wasn't due for another 2 days. He explained this to us the first chance he got, and we all cursed the situation we were in. Go back to the bus stop and risk getting stabbed, or stay away, miss the bus, and end up stranded in the middle of nowhere in Scotland. It was like a military operation. We moved in pairs, covering each other's movements and keeping watch for the machete-wielding maniac. Somehow, we made it back to the bus stop without running into him again. We thought we had lost him and began to relax as much as we could. It was about 5 minutes after the bus was supposed to arrive, and we started to panic again. Some of us feared we'd missed the bus and would need to find a place to stay the night before running into the machete man again. But we didn't have to wait long. A familiar figure emerged from one of the poorly lit side streets. Our hearts sank as we saw the same man, holding the machete. "You!" he shouted again, slowly walking toward us. This time, we decided to take a different approach. Maybe it was the adrenaline or the sheer desperation to catch the bus and get out of there, but we stood our ground. We yelled back at him, pulling out our tiny Swiss Army knives, daring him to come closer. Looking back, it was almost glorious. We went from being terrified, scattering in the streets, to being like warriors defending our territory. What happened next felt like a scene from a movie. As we faced him, he began pacing back and forth in the street, zigzagging toward us while still waving his machete. He seemed slightly put off by our newfound aggression, but not enough to stop him entirely. A dreadful feeling came over me as I realized one of us might actually get hurt. But then, in the distance, near where the road curved away from the river, a police van came around the corner, heading straight for us. It was like the cavalry arriving in an old western, and we were saved. Our bravery doubled, and we even started to move toward the man, pushing him closer to the approaching police van, which he was somehow completely unaware of. He only realized what was happening when the van skidded to a stop behind him, and 3 burly Scottish policemen jumped out and tackled him to the ground. They hit him so hard that you could hear the sickening thud of his head hitting the concrete, but we didn't feel any sympathy. We cheered as the lights in nearby homes flickered on, and faces appeared in windows to watch the scene unfold. Then, just as this was happening, the bus finally arrived, coming around the same corner as the police van. We continued to cheer, grabbing our bags and heading toward our ride home. The police wanted to talk to us about what had happened, but they backed off when we explained that this was our only way out of town. I told them we'd be in touch to give statements later, but we never did. We were just so relieved to get out of there in one piece. I used to love camping. Every waking moment, whether camping or planning a trip, I cherished being outside, far from the stifling monotony of everyday life and trivial concerns. I used to immerse myself deeply in the experience, building shelters instead of bringing a tent, drinking from mountain streams, hunting, and setting traps for food. So, in April of last year, 2 friends and I set off on a 4-night hiking and camping trip on the Appalachian Trail. Carrying packs that weighed over 50 pounds, we trekked 20 miles into the lush green hills before reaching our first significant water source, a long stretch of calm, clear water nestled in a picturesque valley. The journey took 2 days with around 18 hours of non-stop hiking. Our packs painfully dug into our shoulders with each step, but the sense of accomplishment was intoxicating. As days and nights passed, we made our way along the trail, foraging as we went. It was exhausting, a constant challenge, but the peace that nature offers is profound. At night, we skewered hot dogs on sticks, devouring them as we warmed sweet apple cider in our mess tins over the fire. We listened to owls hoot like ghosts and watched embers rise into the air like fireflies as our eyelids grew heavy. We found a good amount of fruit and fresh water was abundant, but our efforts to find protein fell short. We couldn't find any duck eggs, were too slow or inexperienced to trap rabbits, and our makeshift fishing rods weren't as effective as we hoped. We were getting desperate, and although we were trying, one can't live on cereal bars and peanut butter alone. We needed to head to the nearest town, almost 7 miles away. Needless to say, we got lost. After a few hours of walking, we started climbing a fairly steep hill as a shortcut. The whole way up, I remember watching a thick fog cling to the top of the hill, at least 500 meters above us. But it wasn't exactly clinging, it was just waiting for the temperature to drop low enough to roll down onto us, over us. And it did. I remember the image of my friend Chris becoming increasingly obscured as I walked behind him. We tried to stay upbeat, but that changed when we began to see the remains of newborn lambs. April is lambing season, so this wasn't necessarily unusual, but these remains were untouched. No scavengers had gone near these corpses, and there were many of them. We were relieved when the outline of a cottage came into view. We had no idea where we were, and there was no mention of any cottage on our map. My feet ached, and our water supplies were running low since we hadn't anticipated being out or lost for so long. We decided to stop and ask for directions. We had to climb over a low dry stone wall to reach the building since the cottage was oddly set into the hillside. I noted with unease that there was no path leading to or from any road or highway, making the dwelling completely isolated from human contact. We paused as we reached the front gate, or what passed as one. It was made of a few roughly cut tree limbs crudely bound with rusty nails and rotting twine. Chris tried to open it, but there was no hinge. It just fell back into his hands. He set it aside politely, though confused. The small courtyard in front of the door was overgrown with weeds, with grass growing long between the broken concrete slabs beneath our feet. Scattered around the small front garden was an odd collection of items placed in decorative positions. Things were tied to the branches of a sapling in the center of the ragged lawn. Small toy cars, a tennis ball, a hairbrush. A wheelbarrow sat at the base of the tree, filthy from exposure, containing a few soggy books, some VHS cassettes, and a child's action figure. They were strangely arranged in a rough circle around the action figure. Arriving nervously at the door, I reached out, my arm feeling heavy as I made a fist and knocked 3 times, feeling the door shake under the force. Then we waited, listening for any signs of life. Peering through a small, grimy window to the right of the decaying door, I could make out more assorted, seemingly unrelated items scattered on shelves and tables. That's when I turned to Chris. I remember simply saying that we should move on, that no one was home, but he didn't respond. There was something about him. He looked pale and confused. I can hardly describe it now that I try to recall it. He'd been looking through the dirty windows while I knocked on the door and had gotten a much better look inside the house. It was almost like he had seen something but couldn't explain what. He began shaking his head violently, breathing heavily as he hurried out of the small courtyard. I was confused, a little scared, and began shouting after him, asking why he was acting so strange. Yes, the little cottage was odd, but he was acting like he'd seen a ghost. He only replied to me once, through gritted teeth. "We need to leave now." Later that night, while we were nursing beers around our campfire, I finally gathered the courage to ask him what he'd seen through the window. He started shaking his head in that same odd way, stuttering as he tried to find the words to express himself. He explained that someone had been in that cottage the whole time, hiding from us. As I had been knocking, trying to get their attention, they had taken one brief look outside at us, right into my friend's eyes. He said that he had never seen anyone so disturbed, that he couldn't tell if they were disabled or if they had been beaten so badly that their face was disfigured. He said that when they locked eyes, the figure on the other side of the glass looked terrified. But there's no way they could have survived alone up there. Something else was living there too, something that might have been heading back to the cottage to arrive at any moment. I thank God Once a year, my stepdad's family usually has a small camping trip down in South Carolina. My mom's been married to him for about 6 years now, so I've had the chance to join a few of these trips whenever work allows. The first trip I went on was right after Mom and my stepdad got married. My little brother and I packed up my stepdad's truck with camping gear and took the 9-hour drive from our home in Pittsburgh down to South Carolina, where he's from. We had just crossed into West Virginia when we made our first stop for gas. We all got out to stretch and used the bathroom while my stepdad gave an elderly attendant some money to fill up the tank. After finishing in the bathroom, I headed back to the truck and ended up having a chat with the attendant. He seemed nice at first, asking where we were headed and how long we'd be staying. But when I mentioned we were going camping, his attitude changed. "You should always respect nature," he said, his tone serious. "Nature can be unforgiving. Don't bother the animals, and don't leave anything behind except your footprints. Any mess, and the woods have their way of letting you know you're not welcome." I assured him that we respected nature and wouldn't leave any trash behind. But he didn't seem reassured. He finished pumping our gas and went back to his chair without saying another word. A few hours later, we were well into South Carolina when we made a final rest stop before reaching the campgrounds. The rest area was part wildlife preserve, part truck stop, complete with a small information board about the local plants and animals. But something caught my eye in the corner of the board. Carved into the white plastic were the words "Respect Nature." It was the same thing the gas station attendant had said to me. It was strange. Sure, but I figured it had to be a coincidence. The same words, yes, but hundreds of miles apart. No way it could be the same person. That kind of thing only happens in silly horror movies. Naturally, I didn't mention this to my mom or stepdad. I mean, why would I? It seemed crazy to think there was a connection between the gas attendant and the carved message. So we just got back in the truck and continued on toward the campground. When we arrived, we greeted the extended family with hugs and handshakes before getting to work setting up the large luxury tent we'd be sleeping in. Once we were done, we hung out with the family and filled up on barbecue. My stepdad's entire family was just as kind as he was, and I should probably mention that my stepdad was a much better parent than our biological dad. So, aside from the initial adjustment period, I was glad my mom had found someone good for her. After an evening around the campfire singing old songs with my stepuncle on the guitar, we headed back to our tents to get some sleep. But when we got there, we saw something lying in the grass near the entrance. A dead bird. My little brother started freaking out. The thing was already starting to decompose, and a huge collective ew echoed through the trees when the smell hit us. My stepdad calmed us down with a joke about my little brother's car farts being way worse, then got rid of the bird as we got ready for bed. But I watched him in the light of his flashlight as he used a stick to move the bird away from our campsite. He knelt down and pulled something from under the bird's wing, something that looked like a note. When I asked him about it, he brushed it off like he hadn't found anything. I wanted to ask more questions, but the look in his eyes stopped me. He was seriously spooked. The next morning, some of the other family members mentioned hearing footsteps outside their tents during the night. They were asking around, trying to find out if anyone had gone for a late-night walk or if we had any sleepwalkers in the group. But no one admitted to being out of their tents so late, and that's when the atmosphere started to get tense. The second night was quieter. There were no footsteps outside anyone's tent, but I still didn't get much sleep. In the dead of night, I heard my little brother's voice across the tent. At first, I thought he was reading aloud, which he often did at that age, but there was no flashlight, so he didn't have a book. I strained to hear what he was whispering, and I thought I was going crazy when I finally made out the words. He was reciting the information from the wildlife board back at the rest stop in South Carolina, word for word, using big words that I knew he didn't know. He eventually stopped, but I was so freaked out that I couldn't get any decent sleep. I woke up exhausted to the sound of my stepdad's voice. He sounded unusually stern. When I stepped outside the tent, I saw why. Everyone was packing up their stuff and loading it into their vehicles. We were supposed to stay for a few more days, but the mood was tense, and no one was talking as they quickly packed up their gear. My stepdad asked me to help and to do it quickly. The look in his eyes told me not to ask questions. We were back on the road to Pennsylvania by noon. I was so relieved to be out of there that I kept quiet the entire way home. But I needed to know what had scared everyone so much. I also needed to ask my stepdad what he had found under that dead bird. But the timing had to be right. We got home late, so late that my stepdad had to carry my sleeping brother from the car to his bed. After a late supper, I finally caught him alone in front of the TV. He knew what I wanted to ask before I even spoke. There had been a note under the bird, just as I'd thought. He told me it said, "Go home," but he figured it was either a prank by local teenagers or one of his cousins who resented that he had moved to the north. So he ignored it. I asked if he'd heard my little brother sleep-talking, but the confused look he gave me told me he hadn't. He did explain, however, what had spooked the family enough to make them leave the campground early. The cousin he suspected of leaving the first note had woken up at dawn with a bladder full of beer. Half asleep, he shuffled out of his tent to relieve himself and then headed back. That's when he noticed the dead deer near the fire pit. Someone had left it as a message. He woke up my stepdad and asked him to move the deer before anyone else saw it and freaked out. Once that was done, they woke everyone else up and got them moving. But that wasn't the worst part. My stepdad explained that whoever had left the deer had carved something into its flesh. They must have done it while the deer was still alive because the letters were formed from clotted blood rather than open wounds. There were just 2 words, 2 small words. I asked him what they said. He sighed. I have always loved driving, spending hours on the road with music playing and letting my mind wander. Sometimes, I even end up sleeping in my car by the side of a quiet country road. I usually travel solo since I don't enjoy being a passenger. Most times, I'll take a nap, wake up, and head home without any issues. Occasionally, I've been startled by a deer or someone knocking on my window to check if I'm okay, which has made me jump, but nothing compares to what happened last night. I took my dogs out for a nice walk at a place I read about online. It was a good 5-hour drive away, and I planned to break up the journey by stopping every hour or so to explore, ensuring the dogs didn't get too restless. I packed enough food and water, planning to be out for a day. The park I was headed to is a popular spot with lots of caravans and the like staying overnight. It was a beautiful day, and we had a great time. When we reached the spot where I planned to sleep, there was no space left to park. The parking area wasn't well defined, so you just had to find a spot where you weren't blocking anyone. It was a small parking area that could only hold about 10 vehicles without getting too cramped. A bit annoyed, I decided to keep driving and eventually pulled into a lay-by to rest before heading home. I let the dogs out to stretch their legs, then settled in to sleep, thinking nothing of it. The place I parked was across from a small cottage, but not directly in front of it, and there were plenty of trees around, so I didn't feel like I was intruding. I felt very safe. However, for some reason, I couldn't seem to fall asleep, which was unusual for me since I usually sleep like a log in my car, which is spacious and comfy. I genuinely believed there was nothing to worry about, until a long, high-pitched scraping noise jolted me and the dogs awake around 11 p.m., just as I had dozed off. The dogs went berserk, barking like mad, and I was still groggy when I noticed a very tall man, probably in his 50s, dragging what looked like a key around the edges of my car. He moved slowly, never taking his eyes off me, with a wicked grin on his face. Terrified, I quickly adjusted my seat and started the car, ready to speed off, but he walked to the front of the car where I couldn't reverse due to the trees. That's when I saw he was holding a butcher knife, which he lifted and waved at me. I screamed and hit the horn, and my dogs were going wild, practically foaming at the mouth, but it didn't seem to bother him. This eerie standoff lasted maybe 10 to 15 seconds. Then he just turned around and walked back across the road into the cottage. I drove home without stopping, completely shaken. I've decided never to do that again. Thanks for ruining it for me, truly terrifying man, and for messing up my car's paint. I'm not sure if he was trying to teach me a lesson for parking near his house or what, but it's something I'll never forget. I had just turned 21, so I hadn't been to many bars before. My buddy was already pretty tipsy when we headed out since he'd been drinking on the way. When we got to the bar, I sat down, and a girl with bright, almost unnatural, red hair came over to chat with us. She introduced herself as Amber. She was flirting with both of us, though my friend was already pretty far gone. I played along, acting like I was more drunk than I actually was, just to keep things going. Amber seemed like she might be looking for free drinks, so I told her we didn't have much money. Surprisingly, she offered to buy us drinks and kept them coming. I started getting confused about whether she liked me or my friend more. At one point, my friend went to the bathroom, but he got kicked out by the bouncers before he could come back. Amber and I followed him outside, and she kept insisting that he should go home with her. He was so out of it that he could barely respond. I told her he was too drunk, and I couldn't let him go off like that. I didn't want him waking up hungover in some strange place with no idea what had happened. Amber kept pushing, saying she'd take care of him, but I insisted that if he was going anywhere, I had to go with him since he was my responsibility. I think she assumed I was jealous or something, but my friend could barely stand and seemed to have lost interest in her anyway. Then, she shifted her attention to me and offered to call a cab for my friend so we could go to her place alone. I'd had a few drinks by this point and was feeling buzzed, so I agreed. We put my friend in a cab, and then Amber and I walked to her car. On the way, I stumbled a bit, and she joked, "You're pretty drunk, huh?" With a smile, holding onto my arm. I admitted that I was, but something about how smoothly everything was happening made me a little uneasy. We got in her car, and she suggested stopping at a liquor store to get more to drink, offering to pay. I didn't really want to drink more, but I didn't want to seem boring, so I asked her to get me a small bottle with some juice to chase it. She came back with a lot more than just a small bottle, and I assumed she wanted to drink too. As we drove, we passed the bottle back and forth, but I noticed she was only taking tiny sips while encouraging me to drink more. I started pretending to drink by spitting the liquor into the juice bottle, then tossed the bottle out the window so she wouldn't notice. She seemed to believe I was much drunker than I really was. I called her by the wrong name a few times on purpose to see how she'd react, but she didn't correct me, which made me think she might have lied about her name. We eventually reached her house, and I pretended to stumble and trip as we got to her front door. She helped me inside, and I noticed she locked the door behind us, which struck me as odd. I asked to use the bathroom, went inside, and locked the door. I looked at myself in the mirror, feeling uneasy, like something wasn't right. I turned on the sink to make some noise and made myself throw up the liquor I had drunk earlier. Then, I drank some tap water from my hands to sober up. I still wanted to hook up with Amber, but I felt like I needed to stay sharp. As I turned off the sink, I heard her talking to someone. "He's really drunk, barely able to stand." "You do it," she said. My heart started racing. Who was she talking to? Do what? I walked out of the bathroom and into the living room, just in time to see Amber heading into another room. All I saw was the back of her head with that bright red hair disappearing into the darkness. "Hey, where are you going?" I slurred, trying to sound drunk. She came back into the living room and suggested we go to her room. But as I looked at her, I realized her face was different. It was a completely different girl wearing the same wig. My heart nearly stopped, but I tried to act like I didn't notice. I smiled and told her I needed to use the bathroom one more time, apologizing for being so drunk. She seemed irritated but told me to hurry. I went back into the bathroom, locked the door, and heard her whispering to someone again. This time, I thought I heard a man's voice respond. I didn't catch what they said, but it was clear something shady was going on. I knew I had to get out of there. I opened the bathroom window and climbed out, running faster than I ever have in my life. I didn't look back, just kept running through yards until I hit a road. Eventually, I reached a convenience store and stayed in front of the camera, calling a taxi to take me home. I still wonder what they were planning that night. Why did she use a fake name? Why were they so insistent on getting us drunk? And what was with the wig? I can't shake the feeling that I narrowly avoided something terrible. I live near the American River in Sacramento, California, just a few miles from the river itself. A short walk from my neighborhood leads to an old part of town where all you'll find are chickens roaming around in small, family-run businesses. My first job was at a family-owned coffee shop in that little town when I was 16. To give you some context, a lot of homeless people would gather by the river, and they often wandered into the shop. I got used to dealing with different folks almost every day, and it didn't bother me much. But there was one guy I remember vividly, and it still gives me chills to think about. When I first started at the shop, it took me a while to get to know the regulars and remember their names. There were so many faces, but one face stood out more than the others for some reason. A short, bald man with a wide nose and thin glasses. He wasn't very old, but not young either. He had a habit of standing outside the shop for about 10 minutes every day before coming in. Once inside, he would stand in the back of the cafe, just watching me and my coworkers as we cleaned and made coffee. Sometimes he wouldn't order anything, but when he did, it was always the same. A small black coffee and a little serving of potato salad. Every time, he would ask for napkins and a pen after ordering. Then, he'd write something on one of the napkins, leave his empty cup on the table, and take his food to go, usually standing outside the shop, watching us as we cleaned up after him. Over time, I noticed that he seemed a bit annoyed whenever I wasn't the one to pick up his trash. He started leaving small notes on the napkins in rough, poor handwriting. At first, the notes seemed harmless, even sweet, like a simple thank you. But slowly, they started to get weirder. What started as simple notes like, "Have a great day," turned into things like, "You look beautiful today," or "I love your hair." My coworkers would sometimes joke about the notes if they found them before I did. But once he realized other girls were picking them up, he started leaving them on the counter near the espresso machine, where only I would see them. One note even said, "You make me happy, Kate." To this day, I still don't know how he learned my name or who he asked, but I suspect one of my coworkers might have told him when I wasn't around. As the weeks went on, I started feeling more and more uncomfortable whenever he stood outside, watching me work, or when he ordered from me directly. But I always smiled and thanked him as I got his coffee and salad, keeping my customer service persona intact. Then came the part that really got creepy. One day, toward the end of summer, he did his usual routine of looking through the window before coming in to order. But this time, he didn't ask for napkins or a pen, just his coffee. After ordering, he went to the restroom. I lost track of how long he was in there because I went on my lunch break right after. When I returned, one of my coworkers mentioned that someone had left their cup in the restroom, and it was found empty on top of the toilet. When I went to check, I realized the cup wasn't just empty. It had been filled with something disturbing. I didn't see him for a while after that because I switched from morning shifts to closing shifts. The last time I saw him, he came in late, probably figuring out my new schedule either by watching or asking my coworkers. He politely asked for a coffee, potato salad, a pen, and a napkin. I complied, though I wasn't exactly thrilled about it. He followed his usual routine, drinking his coffee, writing on the napkin, and leaving it on the counter without looking up before walking out into the night. This time, the note he left read, "You're lovely every time. Thanks for the smiles. Leave the glitter to the blondes." I have no idea what that last part meant. He also wrote, "You're a young flower in the sunset, Kate." After that, I never saw him again, either in the shop or outside by the window. I don't lend out pens as much as I used to now. Months ago, I began a part-time job at a large electronics retail store. I'm a woman in my mid-20s, about 6 feet tall, and I used to play college water polo. My main responsibilities were handling calls, assisting with orders, complaints, and scheduling. Occasionally, I helped out at the registers when things got busy. I'm a friendly, outgoing person, and I enjoy chatting with customers, often joking around with regulars, always keeping it professional, never suggestive. This all happened within about 2 months. One day, a customer, an older man in his 60s, around 6 feet 6 inches, who had become a regular, approached me while I was at the register. He was holding a coffee, and I jokingly asked where mine was. He offered to get me one, but I declined several times, saying, "Oh no, I was just kidding. Thanks though," and went about my day. Over the next few days, I started noticing him more often and ended up processing a lot of his purchases. We engaged in small talk, but then he began mentioning personal details about me. Things I had never shared, like my commute, the type of car I drive, its stickers, the college I attended, the apartment complex I lived in, and even the decorations outside my door. At first, I dismissed these comments, thinking he might have overheard something, but then he asked for my phone number. I declined, citing store policy, but he kept insisting I take his number and call him. Again, I reiterated that it was against company rules to exchange personal information with customers. Despite this, he began intercepting me as I moved around the store, placing himself in my path and demanding my number. This happened several times, with him invading my personal space more each time and becoming increasingly aggressive. If he didn't get me at the register, he would get upset, trying to force himself into my space to demand my information. My coworkers had to intervene and physically remove me from these situations because they were worried about my safety. By this point, I was feeling scared and unsafe at work, so I reported it to a couple of my supervisors, but they just laughed it off, calling me paranoid. I started calling my dad almost daily to tell him about these encounters. Finally, he suggested I go to the police. I went to the station, explained the situation, and ended up in tears, realizing just how serious it was. The police filed a report and advised me to give it to my supervisors so they could identify the man and issue a trespass order. I provided the case number to my supervisors, who began investigating. Despite primarily working behind the scenes, they discovered that in just 30 days, I had processed over 17 transactions with this customer. He had been visiting the store 4 to 5 times a week, sometimes twice a day, just to buy small gift cards. After gathering information and taking photos of his license plate, the police learned that he lived over 90 minutes away and was driving almost 3 hours round trip just to make these purchases. When my supervisors reviewed the security footage, they noticed he had been avoiding the cameras, hiding his face and hunching over to conceal his height. They also saw that he would often linger in the store for 35 to 45 minutes, just watching the registers, waiting for me to appear. If he missed me, he would return later, right around the time my shift ended, as he seemed to know my schedule. Because there was no clear image of him, the store had to rely on me to identify him so they could issue the trespass order. He continued to harass and threaten me for my information several times because no one knew exactly what he looked like. It took another 2 weeks before I finally managed to point him out to a supervisor. He cornered me again, demanding my number, but I was able to slip away, and the supervisor approached him, issuing the trespass order for harassing employees. He denied everything, claiming they had the wrong person. When the police contacted him to explain the trespass boundaries and ask for his side of the story, he claimed that I had never told him no, implying that it was my fault. He argued that he shouldn't be banned from the store, insisting that if I didn't want him to bother me, I should have been clearer. I saw him around my apartment complex a few times after that, and a few months later I left the retail job because I no longer felt comfortable there. I had enjoyed working there, but I never wanted to risk encountering him again. Months ago, I began a part-time job at a large electronics retail store. I'm a woman in my mid-20s, about 6 feet tall, and I used to play college water polo. My main responsibilities were handling calls, assisting with orders, complaints, and scheduling. Occasionally, I helped out at the registers when things got busy. I'm a friendly, outgoing person, and I enjoy chatting with customers, often joking around with regulars, always keeping it professional, never suggestive. This all happened within about 2 months. One day, a customer, an older man in his 60s, around 6 feet 6 inches, who had become a regular, approached me while I was at the register. He was holding a coffee, and I jokingly asked where mine was. He offered to get me one, but I declined several times, saying, "Oh no, I was just kidding. Thanks though," and went about my day. Over the next few days, I started noticing him more often and ended up processing a lot of his purchases. We engaged in small talk, but then he began mentioning personal details about me. Things I had never shared, like my commute, the type of car I drive, its stickers, the college I attended, the apartment complex I lived in, and even the decorations outside my door. At first, I dismissed these comments, thinking he might have overheard something, but then he asked for my phone number. I declined, citing store policy, but he kept insisting I take his number and call him. Again, I reiterated that it was against company rules to exchange personal information with customers. Despite this, he began intercepting me as I moved around the store, placing himself in my path and demanding my number. This happened several times, with him invading my personal space more each time and becoming increasingly aggressive. If he didn't get me at the register, he would get upset, trying to force himself into my space to demand my information. My coworkers had to intervene and physically remove me from these situations because they were worried about my safety. By this point, I was feeling scared and unsafe at work, so I reported it to a couple of my supervisors, but they just laughed it off, calling me paranoid. I started calling my dad almost daily to tell him about these encounters. Finally, he suggested I go to the police. I went to the station, explained the situation, and ended up in tears, realizing just how serious it was. The police filed a report and advised me to give it to my supervisors so they could identify the man and issue a trespass order. I provided the case number to my supervisors, who began investigating. Despite primarily working behind the scenes, they discovered that in just 30 days, I had processed over 17 transactions with this customer. He had been visiting the store 4 to 5 times a week, sometimes twice a day, just to buy small gift cards. After gathering information and taking photos of his license plate, the police learned that he lived over 90 minutes away and was driving almost 3 hours round trip just to make these purchases. When my supervisors reviewed the security footage, they noticed he had been avoiding the cameras, hiding his face and hunching over to conceal his height. They also saw that he would often linger in the store for 35 to 45 minutes, just watching the registers, waiting for me to appear. If he missed me, he would return later, right around the time my shift ended, as he seemed to know my schedule. Because there was no clear image of him, the store had to rely on me to identify him so they could issue the trespass order. He continued to harass and threaten me for my information several times because no one knew exactly what he looked like. It took another 2 weeks before I finally managed to point him out to a supervisor. He cornered me again, demanding my number, but I was able to slip away, and the supervisor approached him, issuing the trespass order for harassing employees. He denied everything, claiming they had the wrong person. When the police contacted him to explain the trespass boundaries and ask for his side of the story, he claimed that I had never told him no, implying that it was my fault. He argued that he shouldn't be banned from the store, insisting that if I didn't want him to bother me, I should have been clearer. I saw him around my apartment complex a few times after that, and a few months later, I left the retail job because I no longer felt comfortable there. I had enjoyed working there, but I never wanted to risk encountering him again. A 34-year-old woman relocated from Miami, Florida, to a remote area about 18 miles outside a small town named Pineville. She had never faced any problems in Miami, but after a divorce, she moved in with her mother. It was just her and her 2 young children. They settled into an old farmhouse on her family's land, which required extensive repairs. When they arrived, only 2 rooms were livable, and they spent the next 9 months fixing up the rest of the house. Their neighbor, whom we'll call Sam, was very helpful from the start. He came by nearly every day, taking care of his animals and assisting with anything she needed. Throughout the 9 months, she perceived him as a kind, middle-aged man and never suspected any ill will. The farmhouse had a U-shaped design, with windows facing a central courtyard area. Sam had fenced this area when she first moved in to allow her children to play safely. Since the house was set back from the road and surrounded by farmland, she felt secure, especially as her bedroom and bathroom windows were in the fenced courtyard. Thus, she did not install curtains on these windows. One day, while her son was playing under the carport, Sam arrived in his truck to inspect her car. Before he reached the carport, her oldest son mentioned that he had seen Sam outside his window the previous night. She asked him if it was the kitchen window, which overlooked Sam's horse pasture where he fed his horses each morning. She initially dismissed it, thinking it was just a misunderstanding. Over time, she hoped Sam was genuinely the nice person she believed him to be. Her favorite candies started appearing in her fridge, and someone sent her flowers every Friday for several months. She assumed it was either her ex-husband or her boyfriend at the time, but neither admitted to it. Her boyfriend even joked that it was Sam. The following day, after returning from school, she found Sam working on her car. Her air suspension had a leak, and Sam offered to fix it before she had to take it to a distant city for a costly repair. As she leaned over the hood of the car, Sam stepped back. She commented on his old-style cell phone, which was similar to early camera flip phones. Later that night, her mother suggested that she thought Sam might have taken a picture of her. Although it sounded strange, she didn't take it seriously, as Sam had always been friendly and never seemed suspicious. He had refused payment for his help, which she now realized might have been a red flag. A few weeks later, while mowing the overgrown courtyard, she noticed center blocks placed outside her bathroom windows. She couldn't explain why, but she felt she had made a grave error in trusting Sam. She called her friend and neighbor, Mark, who brought over a trail camera and set it up outside her window around 3 p.m. That evening, she came home around 6 o'clock and was unloading her children when she saw Sam standing behind her. He said he didn't mean to startle her and mentioned knowing her mother was out of town, likely from Facebook. He offered to help if she felt scared or needed anything. After putting the children to bed, she went to her mother's room to catch up on a missed TV show. While discussing the children with her ex-husband, Mark called and asked if her boyfriend was there. She replied no, and Mark informed her that a man was outside her window. The trail camera captured the first image at 9:02 p.m., with her children asleep in her room. Mark told her not to worry, as he was already on his way. Overcome with fear, she quickly gathered her children, locked the door, and ran to Mark's truck where they waited for the police. The trail camera captured images at 9:02, 9:22, and 9:30 p.m., showing Sam waiting outside her window. The police searched the area but couldn't find Sam, who had disappeared into the nearby fields. The camera images helped identify Sam, who was arrested around 2 a.m. that night. When authorities checked his phone, they discovered 9 months' worth of photos, images of her mowing, playing with her children, and even in her bathroom. She couldn't sleep properly for weeks after discovering this. Sam was released the following weekend and went to her mother's post office to tell her that he had found and buried her deceased dog. Despite this, he received only 5 years probation and a restraining order. He still lives across the street. She stayed for about 3 months before moving to a new city, Fort Walton Beach. People who know me might recognize this story because of how chaotic it was. I'm a woman living in New England, and this happened in a decent neighborhood. We weren't poor or anything, but here's the story. A few years ago, the day before my 10th birthday, my mom, little brother, and I were returning home from one of my brother's soccer games. As we approached our house, my brother noticed a yard sale at the rundown house next door. There had been some police activity there before I was born, but I thought it was all over. A man came up to us as we were walking over. We'll call him Tom. Tom was renting from the woman next door who had a house with 4 rooms, 1 for herself, 1 for her disabled son, and 2 for renters. Tom seemed friendly. He played soccer with my brother and chatted pleasantly with my mom. He looked a bit rough around the edges, but I just wanted to get inside and play Minecraft, so I didn't think much of it. This was in October. By late January, a few months later, I was barely awake when my dad picked me up from my bed and carried me to the master bedroom, where my mom and brother were. The master bedroom was the farthest room from where Tom lived. I didn't like being woken up, so I ran back to my room. My dad yelled for me to stay in the master bedroom because the police were next door. I did as I was told, feeling very frightened. It turned out that Tom's ex-partner had come by to collect some things, bringing a new boyfriend with her. Tom attacked the boyfriend with a knife and the police were called. There was a lot of commotion, including guns, but I thought it was a one-time thing and that we'd be safe after that. In March, my mom picked me up from school as usual. My brother was staying late for some extra lessons, so she would get him later. I threw my backpack in the trunk and noticed there were many suitcases back there. She cheerfully told me we were going to stay in a hotel. We drove around town, and then she said my dad would take me back home, and we wouldn't be staying at a hotel after all. When we arrived home with my dad, I saw police tape around our yard. My dad said they had found drugs in Tom's house. It didn't sink in until later, but the full story was that Tom had been doing PCP on his front steps. Someone called the police, who chased Tom into the next town over and investigated the house. An officer picked up a package of drugs and had a severe reaction. Hazmat teams were called and they discovered a drug lab. Initially thought to be a meth lab, the police advised us to evacuate. Turned out it wasn't a meth lab but a PCP lab, and we could return home later. My mom and brother came home a few hours after I did, and that's when it really hit me. I had an anxiety attack, couldn't eat, and hid behind the couch. I didn't sleep that night. Later, Tom was released from jail but continued with illegal activities. However, the evidence room was tampered with, so he couldn't be convicted. In the meantime, my family bought a new house with a large dog, security cameras, and plenty of weapons. My brother and I were already in therapy, but our sessions became more frequent. We were set to move in 2 months. During this time, Tom would watch us from his back porch. My dad confronted him once, and Tom responded with death threats. On the day we moved, Tom let his pit bull loose, not realizing we had already left. He just knew it was around the time we usually walked our dog. About a month later, Tom, high on PCP, went into a local grocery store and picked up a small child. When the parents noticed, Tom dropped the child and tried to hide, but the police caught him. He was released from jail a month later due to overcrowding. I'm not sure what the final outcome was, but I think Tom might have been capable of kidnapping. It's terrifying to think about what might have happened to me and my brother. Tom, I helped you overdose on your stupid PCP. I gave you a chance, and all you gave me and my brother was childhood trauma. 3 years ago, when I was 22 and recently single, my best friend and I started hanging out at our favorite bar nearly every night. It was an Irish pub in a decent part of town, and it had a cozy vibe. We had become friends with the bartenders there. For context, I'm a woman and my best friend is a bisexual man, and there was no romantic involvement between us. One evening, while we were enjoying a few drinks, a man in his 30s or 40s with a strong Irish accent walked in. My friend and I were chatting, and I mentioned my new shirt. The man, who we'll call Liam, complimented me loudly from across the bar, saying how stunning I looked. He asked the bartender to tell me how beautiful I was. The bartender, used to dealing with odd characters, gave Liam a strange look but ignored him. About 10 minutes later, Liam came over and sat next to me. Usually, I'd avoid creepy people, but with just my friend and me left in the bar, I decided to chat. Liam seemed friendly enough at first, talking about his plans to buy the bar, which struck us as odd since we knew the place was family-owned. He mentioned he'd be back in about 20 minutes to get his cousin from a nearby hotel. When Liam returned, he brought a very attractive woman with him. My friend, who hadn't had much luck with women lately, was quite taken with her. I encouraged him to go for it, thinking it would be a great opportunity for him. I went outside for a cigarette, leaving my friend with the woman. While outside, Liam approached and offered to give me a palm reading. He took my hand and started kissing it, claiming to come from a long line of gypsies. He made vague predictions that didn't seem to apply to me. He suggested that his cousins were looking for a fun night and wanted us to show them around. I said we were pretty out of it and thinking of heading home. Liam then said, "Oh, it looks like your friend isn't going anywhere." I looked inside and saw his cousin rubbing her foot up and down my friend's leg. My friend, who usually doesn't get such attention, was visibly embarrassed but excited. Despite feeling uneasy, I went back inside to check on things. My memory of what happened next is a bit fuzzy, but Liam became increasingly loud and aggressive. When I suggested we should leave, Liam started demanding more drinks and threw a fit when the bartender refused. He threw a $20 bill at the bartender and started causing a scene. A man got in my face, insisting I drink what he gave me, and I ended up drinking it. Realizing we might be in danger, my friend and I quickly left, running to my apartment and locking the door behind us. We were shaken and confused about what had just happened. 2 weeks later, we learned from the actual owner of the bar that Liam was a con artist who had stayed at the hotel across the street. He had been demanding a free room and making up stories about drugs to get what he wanted. The owner confirmed that Liam had no children and was not associated with the bar. I've wondered why Liam and his cousin tried to manipulate us. I initially thought it might be a robbery or something worse. I even looked into Irish gypsies who are known for traveling and stealing. If anyone knows more about this or has a similar story, I'd love to hear it, as this experience has left me quite unsettled. Growing up on a well-known haunted estate, I was never actually frightened by ghosts, more curious and intrigued. Despite my interest, there was only one time that scared me so much I swore never to go on another adventure like it. Interestingly, it wasn't even paranormal. When I was 19, my then boyfriend and I enjoyed exploring and decided to go ghost hunting around midnight. We lived in a small town in Virginia, so there were plenty of eerie spots to check out. We often visited places like Old House Woods and Crawford Road. On one occasion, we rounded up a few friends and planned a ghost hunt. We usually relaxed with some drinks before heading out, but this time we just grabbed some fast food and headed to Roswell House, planning to stop at Crawford Road on the way back. That night, everything started off really fun. We couldn't stop laughing, but one friend began feeling uneasy. He urged us to skip Crawford Road and head home or get some fast food instead. My boyfriend and I were set on visiting Crawford Road, and since my boyfriend was driving, our friend had no say. We drove to Crawford Road, known for its spooky bridge on a desolate road. The bridge was rumored to be a site where people were hanged, adding to its ghostly reputation. It was around 1:30 a.m. when we arrived. While my boyfriend and I were not scared, my friend was visibly frightened, which was unusual since he usually enjoyed these adventures. He kept insisting he had a bad feeling, and we should have listened. As we neared the bridge, we saw a car parked on the roadside. The car's lights turned on, revealing two bald men inside, which gave me chills. I told my boyfriend to keep driving, and he agreed that we shouldn't stop. As we turned the corner, the car followed us, turning on its high beams. We were unnerved, but thought it might just be a coincidence. After a couple of miles, the car was still tailing us. We sped up to 65 miles per hour, trying to shake them off, but they stayed close, almost touching our car. My friend was now crying in fear. Relieved to see a highway ahead, we sped through a stop sign, hoping the car would continue on the previous road. We spotted a 7-Eleven and thought if we turned in, they might leave us alone. Unfortunately, they followed us into the parking lot. We were alone in the lot, and none of us wanted to confront the bald men. In a panic, my boyfriend drove out of the lot with the car still following us. At this point, we thought we might die. We had no idea what their intentions were, but we knew it wasn't good. We sped down the highway at 100 miles per hour, and I called the police, though I was frantic and unfamiliar with the area. At one point, the car moved into the other lane, and I saw a metallic flash that might have been a gun. My boyfriend slammed on the brakes, and the other car continued at high speed. We quickly turned around, and by the time they turned, we were already speeding away. Somehow, we lost them and found a busy apartment complex to stop at. Shaken, we all started crying. My friend, who had warned us earlier, scolded us for not trusting our instincts. I've never ignored that gut feeling again. I later learned the area was known for gang activity. That night taught me that danger can lurk anywhere, and I regretted not being more cautious. I was naive to think that a haunted road couldn't pose a real threat. I decided to camp in the Black Hills of South Dakota for some peace and quiet. I found a nice spot in a clearing, set up my tent, and started a fire. The forest was calm, and I felt relaxed, ready for a peaceful night under the stars. As evening turned to night, I started hearing the distant hum of ATV engines. It was annoying, but it wasn't too close, so I tried to ignore it. After a while, the noise got louder, and I saw the lights of the ATVs heading towards my camp. 4 riders pulled up, their engines roaring and their laughter even louder. I felt a bit uneasy but tried to stay calm. They stopped near my tent, and one of them, a tall guy with a bandana, got off his ATV and walked over, sizing me up. "Nice spot you've got here," he said with a smirk. "Thanks," I replied, trying to sound friendly. "Just here for a quiet weekend." The others joined him, their eyes scanning my gear. One of them kicked at my tent peg, laughing. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. They weren't just being loud. They were looking to cause trouble. "Got any beer?" another one asked, a big guy wearing a leather jacket. "No, I didn't bring any," I lied. I had a couple in my cooler, but I didn't want to give them any excuse to stick around. "Too bad," the tall guy said. "Guess we'll just hang out here for a while then." He sat on a rock near my fire, acting like he owned the place. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped. If I told them to leave, they might get angry. If I did nothing, they might stay and cause more trouble. They talked loudly amongst themselves, making crude jokes and comments. Every now and then, one of them would glance over at me, grinning. I pretended to be busy with my fire, but my mind was racing, trying to figure out how to get them to leave without things getting worse. After some time, the big guy got up and started going through my stuff. "Hey!" I shouted, unable to stay quiet anymore. "Leave my gear alone." He looked at me, surprised that I'd spoken up, then laughed. "We're just taking a look," he said, throwing my backpack to the ground. I felt my anger rising but tried to keep it under control. "Please, just leave my stuff alone," I said, my voice shaking. The tall guy stood up and walked over, getting right in my face. "You got a problem?" he asked, his eyes cold. I took a step back, my heart racing. "No problem," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just want to be left alone." He stared at me for a moment, then turned back to his friends. "Let's go," he said, much to my surprise. "This place is boring anyway." Relief washed over me as they got back on their ATVs, but just as they were about to leave, the big guy grabbed a stick from the fire and tossed it at my tent, setting it ablaze. They roared with laughter as they sped off into the night. I quickly grabbed my water bottle and tried to put out the fire, but my tent was already destroyed. I managed to stop the flames from spreading, but my gear was a mess. I felt a mix of relief and anger. They were gone, but they'd left me in a terrible situation. I spent the next hour cleaning up the mess and saving what I could. The forest was quiet again, but the peace I'd felt earlier was gone. I kept glancing around, worried they might return. Deciding it wasn't safe to stay, I packed up what was left of my gear and started hiking back to my car. The darkness and the sounds of the forest felt much more threatening now, and every rustle of leaves made me jump. I finally reached my car just before dawn, exhausted and shaken. I threw my things in the back and got in, locking the doors. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the ATVs chasing after me. When I got home, I reported the incident to the local ranger station. They took my statement and said they'd look into it, but I don't know if they ever found those guys. One thing's for sure, I won't be camping alone in the Black Hills again. I decided to take a solo trip to the Boundary Waters in Minnesota, needing some time alone away from everything. I had heard it was a beautiful and quiet place, ideal for clearing my mind. I packed up my canoe, gathered my gear, and paddled deep into the wilderness. The first few days were perfect. I didn't see another person, just me, the water, and the trees. I set up camp on a small island, made a fire, and enjoyed the solitude. My days were spent fishing and exploring, feeling more relaxed than I had in years. On the fourth day, something unusual caught my attention. As I paddled back to my camp, I spotted another canoe in the distance. It was odd since I hadn't seen anyone else around. The canoe was headed toward a section of the shore I hadn't explored yet. I didn't think much of it at the time, assuming someone else was enjoying the peace and quiet. That night, however, I heard strange noises, voices low and serious, carrying over the water. I got up to look around but couldn't see anything in the dark. It made me uneasy, but I convinced myself it was nothing, maybe just other campers. Still, I kept my knife close by just in case. The next day, curiosity got the best of me, so I decided to check out the area where I had seen the canoe. It was a bit of a paddle, but I wanted to see what was there. When I got closer, I saw signs of recent activity. Footprints in the mud, discarded food wrappers, and the remains of a fire. Someone had clearly been camping there recently. As I examined the area, I heard those voices again, much closer this time. I quickly hid behind some bushes and watched as three men came into view, carrying large bags and speaking in hushed tones. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but they didn't seem like ordinary campers. My heart raced. Something about them felt wrong. Once they were out of sight, I quietly made my way back to my canoe, my heart pounding with fear. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound made me jump. Every crack of a twig sent my mind racing. Around midnight, I saw a light moving through the trees along the shore. It was them. They were searching for something or someone. Panic set in. What if they found me? I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The light moved closer, then drifted away. I didn't sleep at all, just sat there clutching my knife, waiting for dawn. By the next morning, I knew I needed to leave. This was no longer the peaceful trip I had planned. I packed up my gear and got ready to go. As I was loading my canoe, I saw the men again, watching from the shore. They knew I was there. I pushed off quickly, but they jumped into their canoe and started following me. My mind raced with questions. Why were they after me? What did they want? I paddled as fast as I could, but they were gaining on me. Desperate, I spotted a narrow channel and headed toward it, hoping to lose them in the twists and turns. The water was shallow and rocky, making it hard to navigate. I scraped the bottom of my canoe several times, but I couldn't slow down. Behind me, I could hear their voices, angry and getting closer. I pushed myself harder, my arms burning from the effort. Finally, I spotted a small inlet and made for it. I beached my canoe and ran into the woods, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. I hid in the thick underbrush, struggling to control my breathing. They were close now, shouting and cursing. I stayed completely still, praying they wouldn't find me. After what felt like hours, their voices started to fade. I waited until I was sure they were gone before making a move. I navigated through the woods, avoiding the main paths, not knowing exactly where I was going, only that I needed to get away. Eventually, I stumbled upon a small ranger station. I rushed inside, exhausted and terrified. The ranger looked at me, shocked by my appearance. I told him everything. He called for backup, and soon the place was filled with law enforcement officers. They took my statement and went out to search for the men. I stayed at the station, too shaken to do anything else. The authorities found signs of the men, evidence of their illegal activities, but the men themselves had disappeared. The officers told me I was lucky to be alive, explaining that the boundary waters were sometimes used for illegal operations, though it rarely affected visitors. The next day, I left Minnesota, promising myself I would never return. The peace I had sought had turned into a nightmare, and I couldn't forget it. I spent a week in the Adara documenting wildlife. My days were filled with hiking through thick forests, snapping photos of birds and other animals. The place was stunning but isolated, and I rarely saw other people. On the fourth day, I set up camp near a small clearing. It was a peaceful spot, with a stream close by and plenty of shade from the trees. That evening, as I reviewed the photos I had taken, I heard a distant noise, the sound of chainsaws. It was strange since I hadn't seen any signs of logging in the area. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. I woke up early and followed the sound, carefully moving through the woods. After about an hour, I came across a group of men chopping down trees. None of them were wearing uniforms, which struck me as odd. I took a few photos from a distance, not wanting to get too close. Just as I was about to leave, one of the men noticed me. He shouted something to the others, and they all stopped working, staring at me. My heart pounded as I quickly turned around and started walking away, trying to act like everything was normal. I could hear them talking, but I couldn't make out their words. I returned to camp, hoping they would ignore me, but that evening I heard footsteps approaching. Peeking out of my tent, I saw 3 of the men coming toward me, looking angry. One of them, a tall guy with a beard, called out, "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "I'm just taking pictures of the wildlife," I replied, trying to stay calm. "Show us the camera," he said. Reluctantly, I handed it over. As they scrolled through the photos and saw the images of them cutting trees, their faces darkened. The tall man smashed my camera against a rock, shattering it. "You shouldn't have taken those," he said, stepping closer. "We don't need any trouble." "I'm not here to cause trouble," I said, backing away. "I'll leave right now." But they didn't seem convinced. They surrounded me, blocking my way out. Panic surged as I realized I was in real danger. I had to think quickly. "I've already told someone where I am," I lied. "If something happens to me, they'll know." The tall man frowned but didn't move. Another man, shorter with a scar on his cheek, turned to him and said, "We can't risk it. She's seen too much." My mind raced as I scanned my surroundings, looking for an escape. I spotted a narrow path leading into the trees. Without hesitation, I bolted down the path, running as fast as I could. Behind me, I could hear them shouting and chasing me. Branches scratched at my face and arms, but I didn't stop. Their footsteps pounded behind me, getting closer. I came upon a steep hill and slid down it, almost losing my balance. At the bottom, I found an old, abandoned cabin. I ran inside and hid behind a pile of rotting wood, trying to catch my breath. Moments later, the men arrived. They spread out, searching the area. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure they could hear it. I stayed completely still, barely daring to breathe. After what felt like hours, they finally left. I waited until I was certain they were gone before creeping out of my hiding spot. My body ached from tension, and I was scraped up from the frantic run. But I knew I had to keep moving. I grabbed what little gear I could carry and set off in the opposite direction of the loggers. I walked through the night, not stopping until I reached a small town by morning. I went straight to the local authorities and reported everything. At first, they seemed doubtful but eventually agreed to investigate. I stayed in town for a few days, recovering from the experience and waiting for news. A few days later, I heard they had found the illegal logging operation and shut it down. The men were arrested and I was asked to testify. It was a terrifying ordeal, but I was relieved that justice was done. I've since gone back to wildlife photography, but I'm much more cautious now. The Ozarks, I took a solo trip to the Ozarks, craving peace and quiet. I needed to escape from the city, from work, from everything. I packed light, just a tent, some food, and my camera. I drove deep into the woods, far from towns or people, and found a spot to set up camp. It was beautiful, the kind of quiet where you could hear the wind in the trees and the rustling of animals in the brush. The first day was perfect. I hiked, took photos, and relished the solitude. As night fell, I built a small fire and cooked dinner. The only light came from the stars and the fire. I felt a bit uneasy, but I chalked it up to being alone in the wilderness. The next morning, I decided to explore more. I packed some water and snacks and followed a trail that led deeper into the forest. After a few hours, I came across an overgrown path. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but I couldn't resist checking it out. The path led me to a clearing where there was an old, rundown cabin. Its windows were boarded up, and the wood was gray and weathered. Something about the place made me uneasy, but curiosity got the better of me, and I walked closer to get a better look. Suddenly, I heard a rustling behind the cabin. I froze, my heart racing. A man stepped out from behind the building, dirty and disheveled, like he hadn't seen another person in years. His eyes were wild, and he held a shotgun. "What are you doing here?" he shouted, his voice rough and angry. "I was just hiking," I stammered, raising my hands. "I didn't mean to intrude." "This is my land," he said, stepping closer. "You have no right to be here." "I'm sorry," I said, backing away. "I'll leave right now." But he didn't seem to hear me. He raised the shotgun, pointing it straight at me. Panic gripped me, and I turned and ran without looking back. I heard the shotgun go off, the sound echoing through the trees. I kept running, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. The forest seemed to close in around me, every tree looking the same. Behind me, I could still hear him crashing through the underbrush, yelling. I tripped and fell, my ankle throbbing in pain, but I forced myself to get up and keep moving. Eventually, I found a small ravine and slid down into it, hiding behind a large rock. I held my breath, trying to stay as quiet as possible. I heard him above, cursing and shouting. He fired the shotgun again, the sound deafening. I pressed myself against the rock, praying he wouldn't find me. After what felt like hours, the noise stopped. I waited, not daring to move until I was certain he had gone. When I was sure it was safe, I climbed out of the ravine and started limping back the way I had come. My ankle was swollen and painful, but I didn't stop. It took me hours to find my way back to my camp, and by the time I got there, the sun was setting. I grabbed my things, threw them into my car, and drove away as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back in civilization. I went to the nearest police station and told them what had happened. They took my statement and said they would investigate, but I don't know if they ever found the man. I still think about that day, about how close I came to not making it out of those woods. Now, whenever I go hiking, I make sure to stay on marked trails and never wander too far off. I've always had a passion for photography, especially capturing the untamed beauty of nature. So when I got the opportunity to explore the Everglades, I was thrilled. It was just me, my camera, and the vast stretch of wetlands and mangroves ahead of me. I spent the day taking pictures of everything: the wildlife, the plants, and the calm waters reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. The Everglades were stunning. a dream location for any photographer. As night approached, I decided to find a spot for some shots after dark. I ventured deeper into the wild, following a narrow path that twisted through thick greenery. The air was filled with the sounds of chirping insects and the occasional splash of water. That's when I saw them, figures moving in the distance, far from the usual trails. At first, I assumed they were just other explorers, maybe even photographers like me. But as I zoomed in with my camera, I realized they were doing something different. The group seemed nervous, gathered around large crates and bags. They didn't have tripods or cameras. Instead, they were using tools and gear that seemed completely out of place in the peaceful Everglades. Curiosity got the better of me, and I snapped a few pictures to capture what I was seeing. But in my excitement, I must have made a noise, maybe stepping on a twig. Suddenly, the group went still, their heads turning toward me. I knew instantly that I had been noticed. Fear surged through me, and I turned and ran back down the path, adrenaline giving me speed. The sound of footsteps following close behind sent my heart racing. Branches slapped my face, and roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't dare slow down. Behind me, I could hear their voices, low, urgent whispers telling each other to catch me. Terror gripped me, urging me to move faster, to escape the men chasing me through the wilderness. I took sharp turns, hoping to lose them in the maze of trails, but they were relentless, their footsteps coming closer with every second. I glanced back once and saw their shapes silhouetted against the faint moonlight, closing in. Desperation took over, and I veered off the path, crashing through thick bushes. Thorns ripped at my clothes, and the mud pulled at my shoes, but I kept going, driven by sheer panic. I had to get away, had to find somewhere to hide. My heart pounded, and my breath came in short, ragged gasps. Eventually, I found a small clearing. It offered no cover, but I couldn't stop. I kept moving, straining to hear any sign of the men chasing me. The night was quiet except for the sounds of the swamp, insects buzzing, water softly splashing against the reeds. I couldn't risk staying out in the open. Pushing through my fear, I waded into the cold waters of a shallow creek, moving upstream to try to throw off my scent. The icy water numbed my legs, but I didn't stop, terrified of being caught. After what felt like forever, I stumbled out onto a muddy bank and collapsed behind a fallen tree. I listened hard for any signs of pursuit, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Had I lost them, or were they still closing in? Time passed slowly, each minute dragging on. I didn't move, not even to look around. The adrenaline that had fueled my escape was now leaving me shaky and exhausted. But I knew I couldn't rest yet. I had to get out of the Everglades, back to safety. Moving cautiously, I followed the edge of the creek, using the faint moonlight to guide me. Every rustle of leaves made me jump, and every splash of water sent my heart racing. I felt completely alone, vulnerable, being hunted. Finally, I found a familiar trail marker. Relief washed over me, but I didn't let myself relax. I kept moving, ignoring the ache in my muscles and the overwhelming fatigue. When I finally reached the edge of the Everglades, I collapsed onto solid ground, tears stinging my eyes as I fumbled for my phone to call for help. Emergency services arrived quickly, and I led them back to the spot where I had seen the group. But by the time we got there, they were gone, leaving behind only traces of their camp and the crates that hinted at their illegal activities. The authorities promised to investigate, but the fear from that night stayed with me long after I left. I never returned to the Everglades to take photos again.